What's the longest you've ever waited for a game? 2 years? 3 years? 5? Try 10. My name is TamTu, I love Final Fantasy, you're watching Hot Coffee. Guys, I've waited for a very long time to finally really talk about Final Fantasy 15. That's the game I've been waiting for 10 years. This year is actually 10 years after the game was announced way back in 2006, I can math. So there's been so much happening with the game. It wasn't even Final Fantasy 15 when it was announced. No, it was Final Fantasy Versus 13 as part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis universe, which meant there was a common lore, a common universe for Final Fantasy 13, for Final Fantasy Agito, and Final Fantasy Versus 13. All three different games set in the same universe with the same mythology, kind of. The main game that was supposed to come out around that time was Final Fantasy 13, the 13th actual numbered installment of the franchise. So Versus 13 was more of a spin-off that took place in that universe. Everyone was amazed by the graphics, which obviously at the time were pre-rendered cutscenes. At the time, the console it was going to run on was the PlayStation 3. There was no word of PlayStation 4, so back then, we were still kind of used to pre-rendered cutscenes. So as mentioned, Final Fantasy 13 was the main focus of the company to promote, to market and everything. And everything that was part of that universe was set aside a little bit. And as time went by, all we got were just new cutscenes slowly introducing more characters. Now the thing about Final Fantasy is that there's always a new type of gameplay introduced with every installment. And from the get-go, from what we saw in the original cutscene, the idea everyone got right away was that it was going to be way more action-oriented. The only game we had to compare it with was Kingdom Hearts, which had the same director, Nomura Tetsuya. But everyone was worried. We waited 2 years to get a little bit of more info on Final Fantasy Versus 13. So what was the deal? Turns out that at the time, Square Enix was kinda in the red. They were still trying to recover from major financial losses after Final Fantasy The Spirits Within bombed like 5 years before that. So it was a huge crawl out of that. So I imagine that there wasn't enough time or resources to maintain the production of all these titles simultaneously. Especially Nomura Tetsuya, who was being kind of a rock star, yet kind of becoming a new main director for the Final Fantasy franchise. The guy was overworked. Stella, who was introduced in 2008, returned in 2009 footage, where she was actually facing off against Noctis. Made things a little bit interesting. A year later, we finally saw some more gameplay that involved other party members. So, the guys that we see, Prompto with the gun, Gladiolus with the huge-ass sword, and Ignis with the daggers. Really, I tried my best to look like him as much as I could. I even shaved and everything. Adding the huge behemoth made us feel like it was a Final Fantasy again, because from the get-go, this was a fantasy based on reality. This explains all the cars, the roads, and all the buildings that seem more like traditional buildings we see in our real life, and much less a fantasy. Anyway, it was then where announcements were quiet again. In 2013, 2 years after the last news we got from Final Fantasy Versus 13, the PlayStation 4 was announced. Now, it had been 7 years by now. 7 years since the initial announcement. It only made sense that at this point, Square Enix was developing the game for the next-gen console. And that meant that we were gonna wait even longer, because in the same year that the PlayStation 4 was announced, the 13 became a 15.
これが対をなす幻想。
いや、世界は常に変化する。15番目だ。
Final Fantasy XIV had launched already by then, and people were wondering what the next Final Fantasy was gonna be. And considering how long this game was in development and how huge it was going to be now, with the processing power of the PlayStation 4, it only made sense that they turned this title into Final Fantasy 15. So there are a lot more things changed. Remember Stella? I had the biggest crush on her. She was going to be my Yuna replacement. I'm sorry, boo. I'm so sorry. Because now we saw a new girl. also blonde, but she looked younger, had a different hairstyle, and in the huge flashes of all the characters that were going to be in the game, no Stella. So, rest in peace, Stella Knox Fleuret. Fleuret. You know, names. As I said, 2013, with the announcement of PlayStation 4 and the game title turning from 13 versus 13 to 15, it just meant we had to wait longer. How much longer? We didn't really know. Until a demo was announced in 2015 to be bundled with Final Fantasy Type 0. Type 0 was actually Final Fantasy Agito 13 as well. So they were all part of the same world, same lore, so it kind of made sense that it was bundled with it, but that aside, we're not talking about Agito, we're talking about 15. We had a demo, it was announced that the game was going to come out in 2016. It was unveiled during the Uncovered Final Fantasy 15 event, where it was finally said that September 30th was the magic number. The magic dates. That game's leaked beforehand, so Square Enix was rightfully pissed off, GG. 10 years and probably more of development. So what is a patient Final Fantasy fan going to get out of this? This is the first Final Fantasy numbered entry on the PlayStation 4. Sure, we've had our remakes, remasters and everything, but this is a brand new Final Fantasy that hasn't been anywhere else before. Expectations are so high. People want to know what has changed during the past years. So as if the game wasn't already big enough, Square Enix took what they learned from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII simply to explain everything, give us everything we want to know before the game comes out. Brotherhood Final Fantasy 15 is an anime that goes deeper into the lore, the brotherhood of Noctis, Ignis, Prompto, and Gladiolus. While the CGI movie, full-length feature CGI film, is called King's Glaive and takes place at the same time as the beginning of Final Fantasy 15. So we're getting a lot of bang for our buck. The anime series is free to watch. King's Glaive, I think, is going to be out on Blu-ray, but at least it's part of the limited editions, the collector's editions. That collector's edition. I'm so sorry, Wallet. I am so sorry. But 10 years of waiting for a game. We better get a huge game. We better get something mind-blowing, because Square Enix, I love Final Fantasy, expectations are so high. The Uncovered event got me on the hype train. That hype train is going faster than ever. Please, even with what I've played from the demo, I know it's going to be amazing, but I'm still so scared because it took so long. I'm scared, but I'm also really excited. It's a good time to be a Final Fantasy fan because we're finally getting a new one.